And believe me, I really am. I work all over the world to help economies that are at the inflection point. You know the word inflection point, it's like either go this way or that way. And today we're going to talk in less than a half an hour about two really serious things. How to build a next generation economy by using new principles of economics, and how to do the strategy process itself. So I'm going to rock and roll with you. I hope I get it all out. If I don't, forgive me. So let's talk about framework. People live in a hatred of economics and often mystify what it's all about. But it is so simple to understand what is really crucial in microeconomics. There are 4 principles. And if you get these principles, you can transform your economy permanently. I'm going to talk about those in depth, and then I'll go on to the strategy process. But there are 4 very simple principles which are think regionally, not locally. I'll talk about that in depth. Focus on this thing called industry clusters, because they're the engines of your economy. That's crucial. Third is build economic input advantages to power these clusters, because that's where they come from, whether they're new or existing. And finally, to make all these things happen, you have to collaborate to compete. And that's a lesson that our clients all around the world have helped us reinforce. So let's talk about thinking regionally. The reality is that economies do not see political jurisdictions. They don't. What they see is what we call a commuter shed. You know, a commuter shed is a distance people can go for a job in a day, back and forth. So the reality is economic activities are based on things that have to do with what goes on in this commuter shed. And it's so important that we think about this. I'll be using the term think holding company being a macro entity, because guess what? There is no national economy. The national economy is only the sum of all America's regions. And there are 382 metropolitan areas in the US, and many of them are in deep trouble. Some of them are doing very well. But we have to understand that it's those regions that power what our nation is all about. So I want you to think about regions. I want you to think not about cities. Cities are partners, but they're also providers of inputs. And we know this is true that regions are important regardless of federal policy, because, and I'm sorry this is hard to read, but when we've studied how different metropolitan areas around the US have worked, holding constant the current political economic conditions like taxes or deficit or inflation, what we see is how flexible, how varied each region is. So that tells us regions make their own future. That means Kern County can make its own future. And we've worked with lots and lots of regions here and elsewhere, and we know that this thinking can change because we see the results. All the regions that we've worked with over the years, and we're not the only people out there, they are now in the top 10-15% of GDP growth and top 10-15% of job growth. We started working with Austin, Texas back in 1983, and we can go on and on to Wichita very recently, Wichita having a lot of similarities to Kern County. The reality is that we have seen regions take ownership of their future, not as a public program, not as a private initiative, but as a collaborative economic direction. It is the economy that's crucial here. Now, I took a brief look at Kern County, and I know where you stand today in a very simple way. You know, you have a decent GDP per capita, and you rank 56th nationally. You have an annual wage that's pretty good. It's in the 45 average wage, and it ranks 13th. And you have a modest employment growth, but the reality is that you have a lot to do, and I'll talk about this more. There's a lot to do to get yourself successful. But what's really important is the thinking. The reality is that, do you really think you're thinking locally, regionally here yet? Do you think Kern County is thinking about itself as a region? Because if you are, that's great. But if you're not, you have to start, you have to embrace that notion. You have to realize that a person who's looking for a job doesn't care if they cross a city boundary, a county boundary. They don't care where they are, they care whether they're working or not. So keep that in mind. But you can partner, and if you can, the regions that we work with that are high performing, they do not see political boundaries as a barrier. They do not fight with each other. They build their economy from their existing assets and they grow them. And the goal The goal is to create a high-performing economic region that leverages its existing resources in new ways. It creates prosperity, reduces disparity, it creates quality of life. But getting there is the challenge. But thinking regionally, if you could come away from this meeting today with that in mind, I would feel terrific. But that's only one of 4 things I hope that you'll think about when you go home today. Now we get to the real tough part. If regions are the place that we care about, when we wake up in the morning and we look at the performance, what drives and shapes the region? And it's this thing called industry clusters. May I ask, just for a show of hands, how many people in this room know the term industry cluster or have heard it? Well, I'm like the grandpa, one of the grandpas of the cluster field, and I often feel that the term is misused, but it is a very lovely term. What is a cluster? And I hope that you have some fun with this when you think about it. Clusters are parts of your economy that produce a good or service that is traded or sold outside. Why is that important? It is important because when the goods are traded or sold outside, they're bringing new money into your region. So oil and gas goes out, agricultural product goes out, that's bringing in new money. And the reason why that's so important is that if you don't, you should think about this. Your region may have a trade deficit, not a national trade deficit, but a regional trade deficit. Because if you're spending money on a Korean flat panel display or a Samsung product or on a computer from somewhere else, you're sending your money out. And you have to be able to offset that money. So one of the key things about clusters is having a portfolio of clusters in your region allows you to actually create a balanced economy of your own. I'm not talking about the national economy, that's a different issue. So it's important for you to understand that clusters are engines of your economy. And clusters are not magic, and I'll show you some pictures. I would say, if I say Hollywood, do you think that's a cluster? You're absolutely right if you do. Las Vegas, it has a tourism cluster. New York has a financial services cluster. But there are hundreds of possible clusters. And sometimes we forget that it's not about the label, it's about what it does. Does it produce good or service that it sells? That's the key thing. So clusters are a layer cake of economic activity. They are not just companies. So if you have one Amazon logistics hub, that's a company, that's not a cluster. But if you have 5 or 10 of them doing logistical transactions, that could be a cluster. But there's different kinds of strengths and weaknesses to what a cluster offers. But the key point is to understand that when you build a cluster, which you should try to do, you want to have a layer that has the primary producers, the next layer are suppliers and input providers that work with them, and at the bottom, this is what people never think about, are all the economic institutions in the community that service them, including schools, banks, and other people. The key thing about a high-performing cluster is that there's this nice dynamic in the layer cake. The layer cake talks to itself. It understands what they share in common. We need skills, we need innovation, we need capital. And the key thing is to make sure that those layers talk to each other. But what's so cool about it is that you don't have to have an entire economy made of clusters. You only need 25% of your jobs to be in clusters. Maybe some places have 35, 45%. And the reason is, does anyone know why? It's because of something called multipliers, economic multipliers. So if you have an industry that's selling goods and services outside of the neighborhood, to produce those goods, they're spending money in the neighborhood. So there's the salaries for the workers, there's the suppliers that they buy, if the suppliers are local. It's the expenditures that ripple through the economy. And those jobs, those 25% or 35%, those jobs create all the other mom and pop jobs that exist. So we have to think about clusters as being the mother lode of economics. But sometimes they hollow out, sometimes they get very thin. So this is something that's very important for you to consider. Clusters just aren't there. They're just not there. They have to exist in a world where they sell their products. And a cluster can become driven by innovation where they are providing something that no one else has. That's really great. That creates money that you can get that no one else can, right? A solution, a drug, a technology, a chemical. But you also can be a successful cluster if you compete effectively, which means you make your good or service that other people may make, but you make them cheaper, faster, better. But there's another part that people need to think about. A good cluster not only may be innovative, it can also be competitive, but it also captures more of the value chain. That's, instead of having a place that just develops the innovation which it licenses to other people, it's just something that they don't make in the region, the more you capture that value down that value chain, the more the cluster gets stronger, and of course, more multiplier. So a cluster is a machine for generating your economic wealth. And I don't want to spend too much time on the subpoints, but what happens when you have clusters is they take different patterns. There's not a master pattern that you have to have. You can have clusters where you have lots of similar companies at one level. So you just have lots of, like the Amazon place, I'm just using that one. You have a couple of different oil extraction companies. But you can also have synergies where there's complementary companies that have different skills and companies. They're not doing the same thing as them, they're doing something that uses some of the same inputs. And what's really great, as I said, is that if you have that, you also can get more of the value chain. The key thing I try to help our clients understand is if they were shareholders of a holding company that had a portfolio of different clusters, the clusters are something that are alive. Every cluster is constantly moving through its life cycle. So the reality is that no one cluster is, like the same as the next cluster. So if you look at this diagram here, we start in the lower left, we could have clusters that might be just taking shape. Someone was asking me about like clean technology. So you might have some new innovation that hasn't been proven, that's just starting to take shape. Well, it might be the seed of a whole new way of doing things. That's what happened with lots of other different fields. But maybe it grows and moves over to the emerging stage where it's growing faster than the US average in that same industry, but it still is not specialized. So you have lots of hot activities, but what you don't have is a critical mass. So over time, if you take care of those emerging clusters, they move up to the upper right box, which is expanding. At that stage, they have what was called a high location quotient. That means that your region is more specialized than other regions in the United States in that area, which you are in oil and gas, and where you are in agriculture and some other areas. But that's where you want to be, where you have high concentration of employment compared to the US, but also higher than US average growth. That means you're competitive and something good is happening. But unfortunately in life, as we all know, is that some things become transforming. Many industries are going through technological changes, they're going through market changes, people don't want to use something, and they mature. Automotives is a great example since we've heard this bad news about GM. The reality is that every industry does that. It's been done in semiconductors, it doesn't matter, biotech. What happens when you have a high specialization, which is what the upper left box is, that means you have lots of people working in that industry and they're saying, holy guacamole, we're victims, we're going to lose our jobs, what do we do? Well, in a cluster strategy process, you start anticipating that and you help people either become more productive so that they can keep as much of the marketplace they have since they're already big, like helping cars do better, maybe going into electric cars or whatever it is. Or you spin off technologies from that cluster that may not be relevant to the making of a car, but something they know how to do. Like in Detroit, there's been a huge industry booming in the near-net shape casting businesses, making it for lots of other things, for electronics and so on, or for robotics. So the point is, you have a life cycle. Every cluster, you need to know where they are and what they need to get to survive. So I don't want to take time today because I have so much more to share with you, but I took a quick look at what clusters you guys have, and just using my rudimentary appraisal, you have agriculture of 4,900 jobs, construction. To me, it might be questionable whether it's actually a full cluster in the traditional sense, but it's 3,280 jobs. Food processing, 6,000 jobs. Insurance, 2,300. Non-metal mining, very few, and oil and gas very big at 7,000. But the point is, you have a cluster, you have clusters, and unfortunately, I'm speaking as your friend, they're all facing really serious competitive challenges. I don't know how well you're doing since I haven't been down here before, but wherever I work, whether it's Wichita, Kansas, I can see that their oil and gas industry is going through major changes. Their agriculture is going through major changes. You just have to do that. But there are other clusters that you can have that I haven't looked at. I'm going to pass over this. This is a long list of your other industries that you have here, which are not necessarily clusters in the traditional sense, but might be candidates. I'm going to leave that for now because I got to go on. So I've said to you, thinking regionally is crucial. And believe me, it's like fundamental. And I've said, if you're going to focus regionally, you should concentrate on how do you grow your portfolio clusters. That makes sense, I hope. But the third question is, how do you grow those clusters? How do you make them blossom? How do you help them expand? And the answer is this. You have to create advantages in the economic inputs they use. And we do our diagnostic work. We benchmark regions one against the other. We might take 5 comparison regions, sometimes more. And we say, wow, there are 8 categories of inputs that industry uses. And unless you can deliver an advantage in each of those for each cluster, you're going to be in trouble. And I could spend weeks just talking about this, but I'm going to go very quickly over it. And I apologize for the speed with which I'm going to pass through. There are 8 categories. One of them is innovation. And I do a huge amount of work in that area. It's a pipeline of innovation that goes from discovery to development to deployment. And some regions are really good at discovery, like universities and national labs or private laboratories. But what often happens is that they export that knowledge inadvertently. My Japanese clients used to always say to me, Jim-san, we love American universities. We use their research all the time. That's right, laugh now. But when I say that to a governor or a mayor or a university president, they say, what are you talking about? What can we do? And that's what we talk about as part of this collaborative strategy process, building bridges along the innovation pipeline to capture the value. So if you do discovery, we actually help you figure out ways to capture it in development. But if you do development, and I know about an angel capital and other people interested in that stuff, there's a lot more than that. You have to have deal flow. You have to have the right kind of enterprises. So there's mechanisms at each stage. And I work in Canada a lot. I have to say I love Canada, but unfortunately for Canada, they have a really hard time keeping their enterprises that they grow. They end up being brought, guess what, to Silicon Valley or Austin. So the point is, innovation is a system that you have, and if you don't know it, you better find out what you have or build new parts strategically. The same is true for workforce. It's not like there's just a workforce. There is a pipeline that produces skills from K through 12, or even pre-K through 12, which is preparation, to advancement, community college, colleges, and different degree programs, to retraining workers. It's a cycle there too. There's a pipeline. And there's so many baby boomers who are going to be either leaving the workforce or needing retraining, that has to be part of your infrastructure. So there's a system that you have to have, and there are ways we align community colleges with each cluster to help make that happen. There's lots of things that you're doing that I've heard, though, that are really great already. So I'm not going to give tremendous detail on each of these, but even in finance, people often say, well, we don't have enough venture capital in this region. And I'll tell you, that's missing the point. Finance is a pipeline too. You have to have money for innovation, initiation, which is seed capital, and it comes from friends, fools, and family, more often than it comes from VC, because VC does not want to get that early. Angels are at even the threshold of transition point. The point is, you have to have initiation, you have to have capital for expansion, which is where VC and other corporate investment joint ventures happen, but you also have to have money for restructuring. It's more traditional investment banking. But what we find in so many regions, I've had high net worth people who invest in agriculture or in real estate or in oil and gas, and they're spending millions in their own region. But do they spend money in the next generation clusters? No. And why? They say, well, Jim, we just don't have any deal flow. And I said, what? Deal flow? I mean, what's that mean? We need enough examples, cases, work material that we can invest in that has caliber that we can pay attention to. So part of the collaborative strategy process is building that deal flow. Does everyone understand what I mean when I say deal flow? It's a transaction, like a deal like, oh, that's a deal, I should invest in that. Anyway, the point is that deal flow is a jargon term, and it's very important for people to understand. We have to create the flow of innovation, create the ventures that merit investment. If you don't have them, money goes elsewhere. There's lots of money. That's the point. There's lots of money. So in logistics, in order for businesses to survive, they have to be able to move their goods and services. So there's transportation logistics, there's communications logistics. Regions are competing against each other for how powerful bandwidth they can supply. And there's what I call physical infrastructure, like real estate, commercial real estate that's being well used. And we get invited very often to help deal with people who've misused real estate because they think if you build it, they will come. I said, sorry, dude, that's a movie. What we found is a lot of people come to us with technology parks that they think, it's going to be this beautiful place for nanotechnology. And I said, and why would they want to go to this place? So we've helped create a microeconomic concept for what a technology park is that is very different. And that's the point, is regions have to use their assets well, not just have them. I'm sorry to linger on these things. So there are other inputs like resources. Companies need sustainable, reliable power. They need sustainable, reliable, convertible, or recoverable water. They also need waste management. And boy, waste is such an exciting field. There's so many ways to make money that way as well as do good. So that's a system. You have a resource system. You have a marketing system. Believe it or not, some regions don't have the capacity to even invent a product. They don't know what a product is, so they don't have productization capacity. They don't even have marketing and distribution expertise to help bring anyone to market, so they spend a lot of money outside the region. And go on, they don't have any brand. No one knows who they are, or they have a bad brand. But here's something that I know a lot of you will be interested in, which is the seventh and second to last of these categories. Governance. Not governments, but governance. The rules of the game. So many communities around the US are against taxes. They fight it, and they think that taxes are intrinsically bad. They think that regulation is intrinsically bad. And reality is, in our measures, in our analyses, what we found is something very exciting. Most economies that are growing have higher than average taxes. And what we found is the underpinning thing that is necessary. It's not a political thing. It's this concept which we invented called return on taxation, which is people talk about taxes being high or low. What they don't talk about is what we're getting for the taxes. And so what we try to help regions understand is that they shouldn't worry so much about the actual tax level. What they should be able to do is benchmark themselves and show how what you're getting for the tax level that you pay pays off. Whether it's education kids from the school district, educated kids from the school district, or roads and sewers or other things. The same thing goes for regulation. Businesses that we work with, and we've done industrial site location for 40 years and other things like that, companies are willing to accept regulation if it is efficient and consistent and manageable. They know they can't control the world, and they're willing to comply much more than you think with laws. So having an efficient system is different than having no regulation. And administration, you have to have quality assurance. The last one is actually perhaps the most important in its own way, quality of life. We've done studies which try to show how different clusters will come to regions because of the quality of life. And two different clusters, like biosciences versus internet or chip, semiconductor, their workforce have different values, believe it or not, because of how they were educated. So you cannot just make a region say, we have great quality of life, because it doesn't fly. What we found is that you have to be able to show at a minimum that you can provide affordable housing, whether it's rental or home, and you show a percentage of your population that own their own homes versus who don't. But another part is that you have to show people not only can get affordable health care, which is very crucial through insurance providers and through public services, but that the epidemiology of health issues is not greater than other regions that are competing against you. Some regions we've served have high incidence of health-related disorders, like heart disease from stress, or cancer from environmental issues, or children's asthma from other atmospheric pollution. So people look at those things. So in quality of life, you're looking at housing, healthcare, but you're also looking at culture. You have to be able to make the cluster that you're trying to grow feel happy to be there. And certain clusters want to rock and roll in the mountains, and other ones want to play in the deserts, and other ones don't want to do either. They want to go home and read a book. So you have to kind of be mindful of the fact that there's no commodity that's the same. So again, I'm not going as fast as I would like to go here, but all I want you to think about is not memorize anything here, but realize that your economic inputs have to perform for clusters, and if you don't know the answer to how well they're doing, it would be worthwhile finding out. And what you want to find out is, do they produce the capacity that the cluster needs, whether it's skills or innovation or capital or infrastructure? Are they competent to deliver it? Are they delivering these things in a timely, orderly, responsive way? And so that's the key point of that. And a lot of people who like the cluster concept, they do something which is what I call clusters, which is that they have committees. They have a bunch of companies in a room and they call them a cluster. And that's a waste of time. Because what the clusters do is they make a bunch of recommendations that they're not going to take any ownership with. So what I'm going to talk about in a minute is how to make that much more valuable. Clusters are about aligning inputs with outputs. So let's get to that question. I've said think regionally. I've said focus on clusters because they drive the region. I've said focus on input advantages because they make the clusters cohere and grow. But how does that happen? The last one, the last principle is collaborate to compete. It's not about public sector. It's not about private sector. It's about everybody in the economy waking up. It's not about programs and it's not about budgets. It's about using your assets in clear new ways. And the reality is a high-performing region, and we've, like I said, we've done Hong Kong and Silicon Valley and Bangalore. I'll tell you what you see in those places. Business-to-business collaboration. Look at the list of things that they do. They do R&D consortia. They do supply chain consortia. All those things. There's business-to-institution collaboration between companies in a cluster and universities or colleges or community schools. I've seen amazing things that people would not expect because of the economic utility, not because it's good or bad. You have institution to institution. A lot of institutions don't talk to each other. They say, well, you're you and we're we, so do your thing. That's not good. And I've helped universities and schools talk to each other in ways they said, oh, you do that? That's cool. Let's get together, and we create the bridges. So this is life. This is not magic. This is not economics in some abstract way. It's about how markets work. And one of the things I wanted to talk about last is this thing about creating intermediaries to help solve problems. This is something people don't think about. Government was created by humans somewhere as an intermediary to deliver services that they couldn't individually do themselves. Instead of me doing, I had maybe had a septic tank in my yard, I'd rather have a sewer line, but I have to pay some revenue to get the sewage system in there. The Grange, a brilliant, lovely, fascinating historic vehicle. It's not government, it's an intermediary to help farmers do something that they individually did not want to pay for. We have to get away from viewing government as the enemy and to focus on them as an intermediary or a supplier when they're needed, whatever the case may be. So I just want to say that the public utility is a case of an intermediary which is had been given a franchise, but there are many ways of structuring these things. The future is filled with micro-utilities, micro-districts, all of these jargon terms. So I just want to say we have to keep on thinking about how collaboration really happens, how to help markets work. And I think that I don't want to run out of time. How much time?
Go ahead, keep going. You're probably need 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, 10. So, as having analyzed hundreds and hundreds of these initiatives around the world again and again, we found that there are ways to influence how competition, how markets behave. That's why I'm jokingly calling myself, well, actually it was the journalist who called me an economic therapist. I didn't make that up. He said, yeah, Jim, you're like a group therapist. I said, that's cool, fine. The point is that in that therapeutic role, what we discovered is there's certain ways to influence markets. One way is the one that we take for granted, which is to inform markets. You can inform supply or demand by doing market research and sharing it. You can build partnerships. But we don't think about the fact that informing markets is why things happen. The second level is that sometimes you've informed markets, but they're constrained. There's something in the way. So what we find is that you have to enable them. And sometimes that requires simple changes in a procedure. Sometimes it requires creating a new law. Sometimes it requires taking away a law. It's not about blankly deregulating. But the thing about enabling is that you want to make things possible. We've dealt with how you provide childcare by carefully redefining regulations. We've dealt with streamlining building permit systems to accelerate development. But it has to be done in a balanced way which looks at both sides, not just one side. That's why we're apolitical, we're economic. So you can enable, but if you've enabled, sometimes there's still a marginal cost that has to be found somewhere, even though you've provided the information and you've enabled it. And you need to induce it. There are ways that take place in markets all the time where angels will provide seed capital. That's a way to reduce the marginal cost of starting an enterprise. But there are other ways of doing that through using program resources, not just money. So what we want to do is make people realize that there are different ways to move resources around to do good things. You can use my room. That's a reduced cost. Suddenly, that's a marvelous way to get things going. The last one, though, is about sustaining initiatives. And sometimes the pricing system for doing what we do doesn't work well or doesn't work efficiently, and we have to find new ways to distribute the price. You know that phone companies basically charge you a little bit so they can help the lower income people get access to certain things. There are many ways to deal with the nature of pricing, not about taxes necessarily. But we have to keep an open mind about who pays for what. and be constructive about it and always frame it as an economic direction. So, where were I? So this is what we're trying to do. This is a kind of a conceptual diagram. On the left, we have a pile of balls, which are clusters. And those clusters are joining in a partnership with the people on the right side, which are the economic input providers. And what we want is to have an ongoing dialogue between the supply and demand, between the clusters, and they can be on both, you can have people on both sides actually, but that's the logic. The goal is to get a diverse, innovative, adaptive regional economy. Now, the question is, how do you do that? Funny you should ask. The reality is that there's a strategy process that we learned decades ago. We like to keep it simple because we care about making it reasonable for people to do, not because we want to sell it. We want people to do it. And it's so simple that I hope that you guys can take it and use it whichever way you see appropriate, although I'd be glad to help you with it. Here's what they are. And by the way, they rhyme. Please forgive my insipid use of these terms, but it makes it easier to tell. We go mobilize, analyze, catalyze, realize, and then actualize. And here's what they mean. And this is based on doing it lots and lots of times. The first step in any economic strategy initiative is you've got to get people ready to work. It's got to be an economic movement. And there's a structure that we found that works really easily and actually kind of fun. You have to go out and you have to get some co-chairs who are usually neutral people, they're people recognized, so you get 2 co-chair people. Then you actually create a stewardship group, which are, you know, the Scottish term for steward is servant leader. I always say that just in case people don't know what a steward is, but it's a lovely, lovely word. And we really treat stewards extraordinarily, as being extraordinarily important. So we create a stewardship group, we tell the region that we're coming, it's an inclusive process, but it has structure. And that is so key. If you are ready to move, if you're ready to actually make the process work, that's terrific. It just makes things, you have to set the stage. It's not planning, it's not a commission, it's not a committee. I don't like those terms, but people use them. The key question is, I want people to think about stewardship a little bit when you leave today, because there's different, we did a report for the federal government on how to do this sort of work, and we talk about doing collaborative entrepreneurs, catalytic intermediaries, and the premise is just getting people who care about the economy to join the process. That's really the bottom line. But boy, if you get that set up good at the beginning, the stewards will make sure that everything works right. They will make the process correct itself. Which brings me to the second step, is analyze. I talked a little bit about this earlier. There are 3 things that you have to diagnose if you want to basically set the stage for the actions. Because you have to know where you're coming from to know where you're going, right? So what we do is we have 3 kinds of analysis. We look at economic performance overall, prosperity, disparity, sustainability, quality of life, or whatever those metrics are. We benchmark you against those. Then we look at the economic drivers, the cluster portfolio. We say, what's your portfolio look like? How is it structured? How does it compare? How well is it performing? What's weak, what's strong, and what the trends are? That's the second part. And the third part are the economic input advantages, which, by the way, that's the hardest part to do because there's no standardized data sources. But we have to do that. We collect it. We tell a story. So that analysis is important as a benchmark point of departure. And what we usually do is have a big town hall event. And at that town hall event, we have the people who are from those parts of the economy tell their story. Consultants are irrelevant. They're just behind the scene. But we have the people from the schools talk about how they benchmark. We have people from the clusters talk about where they stand. And it's really a come home to mama type of situation where we say, you know, we didn't realize this is where we were. We better get our act together. And that sets the stage for the next part of this thing. But the point of this is that we want to really make sure that that people know where they are. That's the key point. We just want to, it's not, people do need a diagnosis like a doctor does a diagnosis. So I'm going to skip over this stuff. This is just pre-principle. So if you have the analyze done well, it brings you to the third phase, and this is the heart. This is where the rubber meets the road, or whatever metaphor you want to use is. This is the toughest, but most exciting, and it moves really fast. How many people think this process takes a year to do? How many think it takes 2 years? How many think it takes 6 months? No, it takes 6 months to 9 months to do this, depending on who's behind it. But the reality is that you want to get this process concentrating on this part. You have to organize each cluster, which is a cluster group in our experience is anywhere between 35 and sometimes 100 companies, suppliers, and schools, banks, regulatory, in the room for each cluster. So we might have for between 6 and 8 of these groups. We have 400 to 800 people. It's a lot of fun. And they meet 3 to 4 times. It is fun. It really is. I get to do it. So what happens is that we call this process convening the marketplace, and we really do. And what happens is the first time we meet, we have everyone looks at the diagnosis, and when I say, we go around the table, we say, okay, who has a problem that they're willing to work on with other people? And of course someone says, you know what they ought to do? And I say, shut up. There's no they ought to do. It's a problem that you have that you're willing to work with other people on. And it really takes a while for people to absorb that. We're not doing this for someone else. We're doing this for you. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And they chill out and they say, oh, I get it. And then we have a process for managing that. It's a lot of fun. But the point, the first time they set up challenges that they're willing to work on, we prioritize. And we might have 35 challenges with about 6 to 9 challenges that they prioritize. So each cluster has that. But then we bring all the co-chairs of the cluster groups which we organize together. So there are different clusters in the room with our stewards. So 35, 60 clusters. The stewards are saying, so what'd you guys do? And the cluster 1 says, well, we had these challenges, blah, 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 blah. And the cluster 2 says, that's interesting. We did this. We had different clusters, but kind of overlapping with that one. And the other guy says, yeah, not this one, but that one. And what we find is there are commonalities across the clusters, which we call the basis for flagships, cross-cutting regional initiatives. So the point is, we start bottom up and we aggregate moving forward. And we do, I use that word again, we use deal flow, cluster deal flow. So the point is, first time we do challenges. The next time they meet, we bring all these examples from around the world. And this time we say, what actions are you going to work on collaboratively in the challenges that you prioritize? And so they say, we could do this, we could do that, we could do that. And they come up with a lot of discussions. They prioritize them. And they now have, for each challenge, they have a bunch of actions that they're willing to work on. And then we sign up for action teams. And the third time we meet, I didn't say, we also bring that up to the stewards. And this time we say, what actions do you guys come across? And it turns out we find a lot of similar actions, but sometimes complementary or different sides. Or we could create scale by bringing them together to create a regional flagship. The third time we meet, we do business plans. I won't spend much more time on that, but the business plans are collaboratively developed, and they're only, if there's nobody doing them, if there's no one signed up to do them, we just fire them or exit out and just put on the back burner. So what we want is this matrix, except no one ever looks at this. We don't show it to anybody. But what we want is to help each cluster find what they need to form new enterprise, to expand existing enterprise, and to attract enterprise, and whether or not it takes something in innovation, workforce, finance, logistics to get there. And it's actually, each cluster will have its own strategy with a set of actions that are very coherent, that are for the people in the room who are parties to this. It's very logical, and it works really well because it's simple. And our motto is, small solutions, not grand illusions. A wave of small solutions is what we want, and that's what we get. We rarely have a disaster. What we have is people saying, you know, that one problem that we saw, excuse my Italian here. I usually say my economics language, but the reality is that people realize that the marketplace has not been convened. In Silicon Valley, even they had certain, wow, why weren't we talking about this? Austin, Texas said, we're going to talk about this again and again. We're going to work. They were very good at organizing themselves. Some people just do it more systematically. But the reality is you get these results. You get innovation initiatives. I'm not going to read them all to you. You get workforce initiatives. You get finance initiatives for each cluster, which we aggregate upwards. That's the key point. We call them the things we aggregate upwards, flagships, as I've said. But there's two really interesting types of flagships that can happen. One type of flagship is what we call a legacy, where we're cleaning up a past problem. Sometimes it's an issue which has been pestering people and driving them crazy. And everybody, we now have an economic lobby, not an industrial lobby, but a communal lobby that has clout in a political or regulatory or business sense. It can change how employers work. They suddenly campaign around it, or it can change a policy. That's common. But more typical is we get a catalytic initiative where there's a consortia that says, these 3 clusters, they want an innovation institute that focuses on creating intellectual property and technology commercialization in this area to grow this cluster. And that becomes a pooling of resources. So that's very cool. So I'm about out of time. I'm going to tell you the last step, and then we will terminate this presentation. The 4th step is actually the hardest of all the steps, but yet in certain ways it looks simplest. And this is when we've created the cluster strategies and we've aggregated the flagships, we actually have to create a vehicle that will sustain their implementation. And that, in the realize phase, is it depends on the region, because there are existing economic development agencies who think they own this turf. Sometimes the Chamber of Commerce owns it, sometimes there's other groups. And we say, look, we're not going to tell you who it is or whether it should even be those existing. Maybe we need to create a new partnership that you co-fund, which is what happened to us many years ago in Wichita. They took their chamber and their economic development department and they merged them together in the greater Wichita area. And they've done it again. We did it in '83 and then we did it back in 2015. They redid it in a different way. The point is, it's difficult because there's no absolute there. I've heard people say you're going to do development corporations. Again, because of state laws, we're going to revisit that concept. I hope you don't revisit the old models. That's all I can say. The reality is, what you really need is a collaborative economic engine system. We call them partnerships, a regional economic partnership. But the point is, it has to be a convergence of interests. But the actual entity, the implementation entity, it doesn't have to be a big entity. It just has to convene people. It has to watch them and attract them. And that's the key thing. If it has some budget to help the action teams and give them a small amount of change just to do a project that will lead to an ongoing entity, that's all right. The point is that we're not talking about using bonds. We would go to another agency for bonds. We're not talking about running a program. The programs either have their budgets or they change what they do. That's what this is about. This is about changing how markets work. And that's really the key point. This is a kind of it's called a semi-last point. I'm going to jump it. Where did I go? Well, this is the key point. I hope you read these because I can't see them without my glasses on. The reality is that people who get involved with these processes feel they've done something so meaningful, and that when they stay in place, which is hard, we've had them last for 5 years and go away and then be reborn again. We've had them sometimes last for 20 years. The reality is that it's up to you and your culture to reshape it, to make yourselves in the light of what you believe in, which is convening the marketplace. It's the economy that's the customer here. It's building a next generation economy. That's cool. It's fun to do. And you can keep it going. I'm going to skip the actualized phase because that's just implementation. But this goes back to that earlier diagram. The key is to create a regional partnership where you have delegates from each cluster represented at the table on a quarterly basis. You have delegates or representatives of the public or private input institutions, and you talk about how the market is working to solve economic problems. And you have a strategy from the initiative. If you did one, you could do a new one every year or every 2 years. Most people don't do them but what they do is they do quarterly updates and improvements when they work. So I'm going to stop there and see this. Yep, that was all I was going to say. It's something. Yeah. I would love to say that everyone stays the course, but I'll tell you one thing is even if you don't stay the course, I'm being realistic here, you will get such a high return by your doing this yourselves, however you do it. Just because people in this room will be at the table and agree to do something different in your operation, whether you're with a company or an institution, this openness, this dynamism is going to make your economy work better, I guarantee you. If you do it systematically on a more structured basis, it will power it forward. But it never is, there's no magic solution that happens overnight. It's working using your existing resources in new ways. And I think I'll stop with that. Thank you very much. I know I talked too much. Q&A. If you have questions, if you dare.
biggest definition of a region that you've seen or worked with?
We use the commuter shed, as I said, as our the question was, what is the largest scope of a geographic region that we've used? And the answer is we've used some huge ones, but the huge is just a matter of definition. For example, we generally use metropolitan statistical areas as in the US, but we've done much larger regions. In China, I did a Heilongjiang province, and it was like, it's like a day drive to get to the other side. I mean, long, long drive. So it depends on, but you end up finding that you start, it's a sub-state level where there's an economic cohesion. And if it's not a cohesion, you might say, we'll split that off. In Wichita, we did southeast Kansas. That was very simple. In Baton Rouge, we did seven, what do you call the church group? Parishes. Sorry, it's been a long time. We did LA County, but we actually did it. That was for PG, for Southern Gas, SDG, whatever they call them, something. The point is, the definition has to do with what you can get in the way of leadership and stewardship. And you can compartmentalize certain things if you need to.